The latest Stephen King novel is entitled Fairy Tale, so you kind of know what to expect going in. And yeah, whatever you think of when you hear the words fairy tale is likely at least somewhat relevant to this book. However, King's fairy tale, while borrowing from and in many cases citing by name its multitude influences, manages to combine elements of stories from such a wide range of authors, time periods, and genres that it somehow establishes its own identity through this culmination of familiar tales. Also, it might be about man-made climate change and the violent colonization of indigenous peoples a little bit too, though, perhaps. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. If you're into Stephen King, dark fairy tales, and watching someone struggle to talk about a book days after its publication without spoiling it and having a really hard time, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Normally I put videos out every other Saturday, but I wanted to get this one out ASAP since it's a new King book, and I wanted to get my video out before all the other booktubers and King channels and be the first. Oh, come on! How do they have time to read a 600-page book in less than 48 hours? Oh well. So in a lot of ways, fairy tale is a departure for King, but he treads some familiar ground here as well. King has, of course, gone headlong down the fantasy realm rabbit hole on numerous occasions. For example, the Dark Tower saga, The Eyes of the Dragon, and The Talisman. Speaking of The Talisman, the book's co-author Peter Straub recently passed away at the age of 79, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge Straub, his many fantastic accomplishments as a writer, and to send my condolences to his fans and his family. Rest in peace, Mr. Straub. For anyone unfamiliar with Straub's work, I recommend checking out Ghost Story, Mr. X, and of course The Talisman and Black House, which he wrote with Stephen King. In these next few sections, I'm going to avoid the plot points and specifics of fairy tale entirely so as to not give anything of great importance away, and rather I'm going to discuss the influences that King's story proudly wears on its metaphorical sleeve, as well as my vague interpretation regarding the significance of the subtext. So, while I will be talking about elements that find their way into the story, I will be avoiding specifics and how these elements are relevant to the story. In other words, I'm going to attempt to discuss the story without discussing the story. Wish me luck. But first, let's start with a short from-the-flap synopsis of the novel for anyone unfamiliar. Fairy Tale, a brief summary. Charlie Reed looks like a regular high school kid, great at baseball and football, a decent student, but he carries a heavy load. His mom was killed in a hit-and-run accident when he was 10, and grief drove his dad to drink. Charlie learned how to take care of himself and his dad. Then, when Charlie is 17, he meets a dog named Radar and his aging master, Howard Bowditch, a recluse in a big house at the top of a big hill, with a locked shed in the backyard. Sometimes, strange sounds emerge from it. Charlie starts doing jobs for Mr. Bowditch and loses his heart to Radar. Then, when Bowditch dies, he leaves Charlie a cassette tape telling a story no one would believe. What Bowditch knows and has kept secret all his long life is that inside the shed is a portal to another world. History and inspiration. Regarding the inspiration for King's story, the following quote comes directly from Stephen King himself and can be found on the inside flap of Fairy Tale as well as on King's website. The statement reads, quote, "Early in the pandemic, King asked himself, 'What would you write that would make you happy?' As if my imagination had been waiting for the question to be asked, I saw a vast, deserted city, deserted but alive. I saw the empty streets, the haunted buildings, a gargoyle head lying overturned in the street. I saw smashed statues of what I didn't know, but I eventually found out. I saw a huge, sprawling palace with glass towers so high their tips pierced the clouds. Those images released the story I wanted to tell." Unquote. It's admirable that King has never allowed himself to remain pigeonholed by his critics or by his fans. He clearly writes for himself and for the fulfillment of writing first and foremost, knowing that not everyone will be thrilled by everything he publishes. He made his peace with that fact long ago, and I imagine it must be liberating to throw off the shackles of preconceived notions and expectations and just do whatever the hell he wants. He's Stephen fucking King, after all. Fairy Tale starts as a sort of coming-of-age, very relatable human story. The protagonist, Charlie, is dealing with the death of a loved one and the perhaps inevitable familial struggles that such a tragic, traumatic event can cause. We meet someone who is struggling to stay in the light, so to speak, but who is given a chance to redeem himself. And King takes his time establishing Charlie as our main character and providing us with the empathetic relationship we need to have with him in order for us to root for him later on, regardless of some less than respectable things he has confessed to doing. But eventually, this threshold of sorts is crossed that turns this story of a troubled young man, this close-up look at trauma and redemption, into, well, a fairy tale. Honestly, it's more epic fantasy than it is a fairy tale, but of course, epic fantasy and fairy tales are just two limbs of the same beast. But once the fairy tale part of this story begins in earnest, we start to recognize some familiar elements and, in a number of cases, are explicitly told, "This part of the story should remind you of this other story." It's not subtle or even lightly veiled. King wants us to know, and so he tells us. Within fairy tale, there are so many references to not only the age-old fairy tales we have likely known most of our lives, but to some classic horror authors' stories, and, of course, some of King's own stories. Now, many people, myself included, had suspected that fairy tale would be Dark Tower related, or at least Dark Tower adjacent, and, well, maybe it is. A little bit. But is it part of the Dark Tower saga? Well, all things serve the beam, at least to some extent, so, sure. Like I said earlier, King makes sure we know when he is referencing one of the influences within fairy tale, so you'll know what I mean if you have read or are planning to read the book. King also finds a way to bring up another of his own books from the 1980s, albeit briefly, and this is something we've seen him do with regularity over the years. Just a quick mention of something King-related from the past that doesn't necessarily have any bearing on the plot. But hey, when your books and creations are such a massive part of pop culture, I suppose you can get away with it. You also have Something Wicked This Way Comes, Dracula, Frankenstein, and Lovecraft all making an appearance in some form or another, and as for the actual fairy tales, there's a bunch of them referenced in the story. Rumpelstiltskin, The Three Little Pigs, Pinocchio, and others I can't remember because I neglected to take notes. So yeah, fairy tale, while not wholly original, it's not really trying to be. It's this culmination of such a wide variety of influences, and it's their acknowledgement and use within the story, along with King's inventive imagination, that make fairy tale unique and distinguishable from its predecessors. My obligatory overanalyzing of the subtext of the story. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular topic, mostly because I don't want to give away too much, so by necessity I really can't spend a lot of time on it, even though I really want to. Alright, so how to talk about a story without talking about the actual story. In the story, in fairy tale, that would all be pretty spoilery. Shit nipples. Okay, so this next section is going to have what I do not consider to be spoilers, but some people might. So if you're worried about it, skip to the time code below. But I promise not to give away any detailed information regarding the story itself in the following brief tangent. In fact, I think all it will do is intrigue and encourage you to read the story. Okay, so there is a subcurrent of this story that smacks of anti-colonialism and how the invading forces who seek to claim land and property bring with them both intentionally violent and additionally unforeseen negative consequences upon the rightful inhabitants whose homes, whose ways of life, and whose freedom and security they have absconded with and destroyed. I was reminded of the Native American genocide, or perhaps the never-ending Israel-Palestine conflict. And on top of that, there are the repercussions and impacts that these invasive colonists have on the environments of the places they pillage when they ransack resources and suck out all the life and color and generally work to deteriorate and exploit that which was once beautiful and clean in the name of power, profit, personal gain, and insatiable greed. But that's all I can say about that without further sliding into spoiler territory. But that wasn't a spoiler, right? I don't think it was. Not really. I don't know. Fucking whatever. Sorry. Final thoughts. For someone who doesn't typically love fantasy, this was an easy read for me. What started as one young man's sad story of loss and heartache gradually became something wildly different, leading to places I had least expected. And there are plenty of gory, horror-inspired elements sprinkled in there for those of us who are into that sort of thing for whatever reason. So it wasn't without its thrills and chills. Is this a favorite of mine among King's vast bibliography? No, I guess not. But is it worth a read for anyone looking to be transported into another world where anything can happen and the stakes are catastrophically high? Yeah, I'd say so. You should read it. In 2 weeks, I'll be returning to the Misery series with the third and final Misery video, which will be about Season 2 of the Castle Rock series, which debuted on Hulu in 2019. I originally thought this show was a prequel to Misery, but that was incorrect. In fact, I'm not sure exactly how this show lines up with the history of Annie Wilkes, that King had firmly established in the Misery novel, but after watching the first episode, I don't think it actually lines up at all. So while I'm both mildly confused and maybe a little disappointed, the show doesn't seem all that bad yet. New videos drop on this channel every 2 weeks, typically on Saturday mornings, usually at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so please subscribe to the channel to get notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.